The war started, and then the war ended. Probably within, what, 24 to 48 hours. A very short war. Each war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, to some capacity, has, I mean, this is not directly between the Armenian government and Azerbaijan, but Armenian forces in Arsach, sorry, I pronounced it terribly, in Nagorno-Karabakh. The first war was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Armenians clocked the Azerbaijanis, pushed them out of a lot of territory that they controlled, a lot more than what the Armenians even control today. And much of that land was taken back in 2020, after the Azerbaijanis had built themselves up militarily and economically, while the Armenians generally stagnated. And so they were able to take back large swaths of the territory that was taken in that post-Soviet war. But apparently that was not enough. And that ceasefire that was negotiated between the Russians, the Armenians, and the Azerbaijanis did not hold. The Russian peacekeepers, which were put in the region supposedly to keep the peace, failed to keep the peace. And the situation continued to escalate for months leading up to the invasion that we just saw. In December of last year, a blockade on Nagorno-Karabakh started. For those of you, let me show you a map of Nagorno-Karabakh, so you can understand why a blockade would be a very disastrous, oh, I spelled it terribly. This is where Nagorno-Karabakh is. You see that little piece of it that is closest to Armenia? There is a transportation line there, which the Azerbaijani government blocked. Well, the whole time they were like, I don't know, are we really blocked? It's not like a real blockade. They were denying it for a lot of the time. Part of it, they were saying it's not us, it's actually environmental activists, even though it was clearly people hired by the Azerbaijani government and wild Azerbaijani nationalists. And eventually, they enforced a full blockade over Nagorno-Karabakh by, I think it was December or January, some part, I think early this year. And that full blockade on Nagorno-Karabakh intensified and intensified and intensified until there was really no food on the shelves, no medicine on the shelves. In urban areas, disease was spreading, and we were getting reports of people dying or coming close to death from starvation. A terrible environment to add violence to, but that's what the Azerbaijanis did. Well, at first they were saying it was just training exercises. I don't know if you guys have heard that before an invasion. They say they were just doing training exercises on the border as they built up the forces, and before you knew it, they were shelling. As of, I think it was 48 or like 36 hours ago, they started shelling, and they started moving in, taking the positions of the local militia, which defends the Armenian enclave in Nagorno-Karabakh. But after 24 to 48 hours of fighting, what most people expected came to pass. The militias and the local defense forces failed to stop the Azerbaijani military. Their positions were getting taken. They were getting pushed back, and the main capital of this region was getting shelled, with local authorities saying over 200 civilians died in the bombardment and the fighting, and there's a good chance we're going to get more reports of those deaths shortly. The casualty numbers would probably continue to rise. And so, Nagorno-Karabakh, seeing the writing on the wall, knowing that Armenia doesn't have the force to intervene on their behalf, and the government in Armenia made it pretty clear that they don't intend to intervene to fight Nagorno-Karabakh because they don't want a wider war with Azerbaijan. With Nagorno-Karabakh not seeing Iran or any other international or regional player intervening, and them being basically completely on their own, they decided to surrender, and they are going to vacate the area of any of the defense forces, and the local civilians are in disarray. They don't know what they're going to do. Many of them are trying to make plans to leave the region. Probably a lot of them are going to live after a mass exodus that is going to follow this announcement in exile if the blockade is lifted ever so slightly so civilians can get out through convoys, and the Azerbaijani military is going to move in. Now, some people, if you've been following this war or following this conflict maybe more than, the last 48 hours, might be asking, wait a second, isn't Armenia in an alliance with, I could have sworn it was Russia. Why isn't Russia coming to defend Armenia? Don't they have peacekeepers in the region? They do. They do have peacekeepers in the region. I mean, they failed to stop the blockade. And they've also failed to dissuade Azerbaijan from pushing and pushing and pushing further. They failed in 2020, and now they failed again this time. And I think the moment that I knew for sure that they weren't going to do anything and that they were basically boned was when, during a round of shelling that happened earlier during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think it was early last year, some FSB agents were actually hit by Azerbaijani shelling, and the Russian government did nothing. Their agents directly, their vehicles directly getting shelled by the Azerbaijani government, and they did nothing to defend their partner, which is in their military alliance. They have been the long-term security guarantor of Armenia ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they've done that when they could have maybe tried to pursue other regional or international partners. But with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russians simply are stretched too thin. And the Armenians, realizing that the Russians are not going to come to their aid, have gone to the Americans. You know, they've been talking a lot to the Iranians. Iran is very fearful of Azerbaijani expansionism, very fearful of Turkish power growing in the region. Maybe they could intervene, but nobody is intervening on their behalf. Nobody is able to develop these ties quickly enough to really change the balance of power, and the Europeans are not willing to give up Azerbaijani gas or Azerbaijani oil and gas supplies, since they have just finished getting off of Russian gas. Well, not some of them have finished. Some of them are still on Russian gas, but many of them have finished getting off of Russian gas, and now they're going to further hurt their economy trying to get off of Azerbaijani gas to take a stand. What if they announce, hey, Azerbaijan, stop all this nonsense. This is wrong. Pull back. And then the Azerbaijanis are just like, okay, we're going to cut off your gas. Are they willing to bite the bullet on that for principle? Probably not. And so while you see Germany and France and Sweden and all these different powers, the United States, all of them condemning the military action, they're not doing anything. Even though they do have leverage, they don't want to risk it, it seems. I mean, the American government wouldn't even condemn the blockade when the blockade was happening, which I think is the clearest thing that the Azerbaijanis done, that even people in the pro-Azerbaijani crowd, and I know I've got people in my comments, they made it known to me, and I got some people in my emails that disagree with my takes about this conflict, but even they have to agree that the starving of the local civilian population is not in the humanitarian interests of the people who live in Nagorno-Karabakh. Either way, the Russians did not come to their aid, stretched too thin, and as I talked about in yesterday's segment, they also are angry about Armenia trying to make inroads with other powers since the Russians won't defend them. And so Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, and I would just say basically the town drunkard on a national scale when it comes to Russia, came out with a statement of, well, you said you wanted to give up Nagorno-Karabakh, and you know you're looking towards the west. Why do you expect us to come help them? Just a complete abandonment. And I'm not the person, like the only person saying this. I'm not the only person saying this. In fact, I would say that the people who are saying this most concretely, that they're angry about the situation or angry about the Russians, you know, not defending them, would be the Armenians. And massive protests are taking place in Armenia, in their capital right now, and they were taking place yesterday as well, condemning the Russian government. I saw a lot of people tearing up Russian passports because there are actually a decent amount of Russian citizens living in Armenia, and a lot of people condemning him and directly referencing the fact that they know that him overstretching himself in Ukraine and his imperial ambitions have now undercut their defense, since even if the Russians wanted to defend the Armenians, could they, under current circumstances? I've said this before, if you put up 90 to 95% of your military resources and you dedicate it to this invasion, what happens if there is unrest in Kazakhstan, as there was a few years ago with the protests after the oil and gas subsidies were cut by the government? What if there is unrest in the Caucasus again? Let's say Kadyrov, you know, the fat pig, actually falls over and dies. He's a quote-unquote uniting figure. It's ridiculous to say, but it is true. If he dies, what if there is unrest in the region? People thinking, well, look at Ukraine. Look what happened with the Wagner coup. Look at the Wagner push. Maybe we could try something on our own. Can they survive another security crisis? The Wagner coup, I think, tested that and showed that they're vulnerable. And so if they're vulnerable in that way, do they even have the resources to dedicate to a possible grinding war in Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, at the same time as they're fighting one with Ukraine and much of the Western world's backing? Yeah, probably not. Probably not. But Armenians are pissed that they've decided to throw away their allyship with Armenia, or their dedication to the allyship with Armenia, in pursuance of these imperial ambitions. The civilian population is the main victims of this, and this is the stuff that concerns me the most. The Azerbaijani government is very, 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 very nationalist. I would even call it pretty ultra-nationalist. Many of them, many of the soldiers have engaged in war crimes and very disgusting behavior, beheadings, torture, executions of both civilians and military POWs. And I am worried about those soldiers taking over villages that are going to be largely ethnically Armenian after they've been pumped full of nationalist propaganda. I'm worried that they could engage in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. The Armenian government says this. Other international human rights monitors have rang the alarm bells on this. They're looking at the rhetoric that is being spat out by the Azerbaijani government, and it's extremely concerning. And even if they don't engage in a campaign of ethnic cleansing, I do not trust the Azerbaijani military to show restraint once they have control over the civilians who don't flee at the thought of being controlled by the Azerbaijani government, or having the Azerbaijani government just, their soldiers, their foot soldiers, in their villages, in their towns, in their cities, walking their streets. Definitely when you know the history between these two countries. A lot of hatred. A lot of hatred. I'm happy that the war was short. It limits the suffering. That's good. That this didn't drag out. The war back in the 90s was extremely bloody, extremely horrific. A lot of people were ethnically cleansed, both Armenians and Azerbaijanis. A lot of people were killed and slaughtered and massacred. In the war in 2020, the 41 days of violence, it was, I don't want to call it a turkey shooter shooting fish in a barrel, but the Azerbaijanis hammered Nagorno-Karabakh. There were war crimes aplenty. And the shorter the violence is, hopefully the less violence there is. But all of that will be negated. All of that will be negated if the Azerbaijani military behaves in the way that they have historically behaved. And I have seen no reformations from it to indicate that it will behave differently once it occupies Nagorno-Karabakh. And that is why I think we're going to see a mass exodus of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh who do not want to live under Azerbaijani rule. And let me just quickly say that there's a good chance that this is not the end of it. Them taking over Nagorno-Karabakh. There's a decent chance that the government in Azerbaijan is going to push for more. I know that might be hard to believe considering how much they're getting right now, but if we just look at the map of the Caucasus, one second, map of Caucasus, there is a little area of Azerbaijan that is down here that's separated from Azerbaijan proper, what's internationally recognized as Azerbaijan. And this is also internationally recognized as Azerbaijan. But as you can see, there is territory dividing it from Azerbaijan right here in Armenia. And they want a secure corridor between this territory and Azerbaijan proper. And so there are many Azerbaijani nationalists and many people in the Azerbaijani government who want to create a corridor. And if the Armenians don't provide them with one, then they might just take it. And if there's no security guarantor for Armenia, who's going to come in their defense and stop them from creating one forcibly? And we've seen the Azerbaijani government cross into Armenia's internationally recognized territory before, as it, who's like hoots and hollers about its own internationally recognized territory. So what if not only do they try to take land there, but they try to take land elsewhere? And there are Azerbaijani nationalists that are pushing for that. So while it's good that the violence was short, this might not be the end of the violence if the Azerbaijani military behaves how it has behaved in the past, and if the government engages in a campaign of ethnic cleansing of the local ethnic Armenians. And the Azerbaijani government might not stop here. And if they don't stop here, number one, I think this should come with repercussions in and of itself. But it seems that the West is completely unwilling to do that. If they do move into Armenia's internationally recognized territory, I believe that should be a red line from the West, and that should come with sanctions, diplomatic repercussions, the expulsion of diplomats, and not only on Azerbaijan, but that pressure should also be extended to NATO ally Turkey, which has enabled them endlessly. But we'll come to that problem when we come to that problem, but that is something I am certainly worried about in the near future. A lot of crazy stuff coming out of Baku right now. Oh, I can't believe I almost forgot this big part of the story. This is one of the reasons I was talking about this in the first place. My goodness. So apparently, one second, let me Russia, Armenia. I can't believe I didn't talk about this. This is the big part that I wanted to talk about this in the whole first place I wanted to talk about this. Russia is claiming that their peacekeepers were killed by the Azerbaijani government. Here is footage. Oh, wait, where is it? Here it is. Here is footage of what is supposedly shelling of the Russian quote-unquote peacekeeping base that was destroyed by the Azerbaijani military. Read some of the report. A military vehicle carrying Russian peacekeepers came under fire and its crew was killed as Azerbaijan stepped up its attack on a breakaway region of Nagorno-Karabakh, Moscow confirmed Wednesday. In a statement released by the Ministry of Defense, officials said that the patrol was hit near the village, oh boy, I can't even pronounce English words. We're just going to say tag. A car with Russian servicemen came under small arms fire. As a result of the shelling, the Russian servicemen in the vehicle were killed, the message reads. The number of dead was not disclosed. The incident comes as Azerbaijan launched attacks on Nagorno-Karabakh, and its armed forces announced they had effectively taken control of the breakaway region in a lightning operation. Man, Russian peacekeepers getting killed, and you know what Russia's going to do? Probably absolutely nothing. Literally nothing. They didn't enforce the 2020 ceasefire. When their FSB agents were shelled last time, they did nothing. And when these soldiers are getting shelled this time, even though they're killed, which is further than last time, they'll probably do nothing. And I don't think it's a question of they want to do nothing, even though the government has expressed that when it comes to Armenia, at least Dmitry Medvedev, but he's a drunkard. They're not doing anything, but it's also just like, again, they can't do anything. If they can't fight a war and win a war against Ukraine, how are they going to fight two wars at the same time? They just can't stretch themselves any further. And so that means that the peacekeepers, quote unquote, are powerless to enforce any peace. It's part of the reason the ceasefire fell apart in the first place. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has had many victims, including those not currently living in Ukraine. Dylan, is this the beginning of the end of the Russian Empire? Did their failed war with Ukraine open them up to the death by 1,000 cuts from withering? Is it time to send Ukraine ATACMS and mass amounts of artillery shells so Ukraine can march on Moscow? No, I don't think I don't think Ukraine can or has the ability to march on Moscow. But it is true that nation states will fall on the sword either for reasons of nationalism or pride or whatever the reason might be. And after falling on the sword time and time again in the same war, that can make it so they're dedicating too many resources to that conflict to uphold their influence elsewhere. There's a reason why you're seeing American diplomats more and more and more in Central Asia. The reason you're seeing that is because these countries are hedging their bets. There's a decent chance that Russia does not come out of the war of Ukraine looking squeaky clean. Even if the war was to win, even if they were to win the war tomorrow, they've taken a tremendous amount of damage, not only to their economy, not only to their military, but also to their reputation And not only just in reference to Ukraine, but for example, with what's happening here in Armenia. Will the Russians stand by their commitments? The Armenians would say no. The Ukrainians, of course, would say no. I think their reputation is taking a huge, huge dip. And so other allies that they have are, while they're not jumping ship, they are certainly looking up ship catalogs of ships in other countries. They're just, they're browsing in the catalog. They're not jumping ship, but they're browsing. It's not illegal to look.